Hola, bienvenidos a ESG Talks de Prima FP. Mi nombre es Daniela Door, gerente de Alternativos y Análisis de Prima, y hoy estrenamos un nuevo episodio de este espacio donde conversamos sobre las principales tendencias en el mundo de la inversión responsable. En esta nueva edición nos acompaña Tycho Sneyers, quien es socio director de LGT Capital Partners, compañía internacional líder en inversión alternativa, y miembro del directorio de los principios de inversión responsable, más conocido como PRI por sus siglas en inglés. Con él hablaremos en inglés sobre las tendencias y perspectivas en el mundo ESG, la polarización que se está generando en este tema y el camino de la transición energética a nivel global. Tycho, thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you, Daniela. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. ESG has been part of the investment world for a long time. So to understand what is next in terms of ESG, I would like to start by asking you, how did ESG start and how much relevance PRI has in the substantial growth that we have seen in ESG until last year?
I mean, ESG is something that really started around 2005, 2006 with the establishment of the UN PRI. And I would call that really the second phase that we have seen in the world of responsible investing. The first phase was still ongoing when I started in 2001 and 2002, when we didn't talk about ESG, but we talked about responsible investing or socially responsible investing. And that first phase was really characterized by negative screening. What investors did was avoid certain industries like tobacco or weapons, and that was really the bulk of their responsible investment activity. That then was followed by the start of the UN PRI in 2006, and since then we start talking about ESG. And that second phase is very much a phase which I would call around process orientation. Investors started looking at their investment process, and they started analyzing the environmental, social, and governance implications of each investment. And really, in addition to traditional security analysis, and in a certain, I would say, conservative definition of ESG, it was only looking at E, S, and G factors and how they impact risk-adjusted return. There was really no broader analysis of how an investment has positive or negative impacts on society. It was really only looking at the picture of risk-adjusted returns. And then the third phase started, I would say, really around 2015. 2015 was a very important year. We had the Paris Agreement on climate change. We had the conclusion of the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And 2015 then brought what I would call an outcome orientation to ESG practice. Investors not only looked at how does ESG impact risk-adjusted return, but they also, in addition, started looking at what are really the positive and the negative societal outcomes that an investment brings along. And I would say we are still today in that phase of this outcome orientation.
Yes, exactly.
I think your second question was maybe linked to the PRI.
Yes.
And I think the PRI has played, I would say, a crucial role in ESG implementation in the world of finance. I think before 2006 there were very few people actively doing this socially responsible investing. Post 2006 we start seeing a huge growth in the number of practitioners of ESG in the world of finance, and we see it even exploding even more in terms of PRI membership. If we look in the last 5 years, we see PRI membership growing at incredible rates. So I do think it is fair to say that the UN PRI has been the main catalyst to make ESG almost into a mainstream investment philosophy in today's world.
Yeah, and we have seen that trend also here in Latam. I mean, the growth of the PRA signatories has been very important in the last few years. Now, how would you describe the effect that COVID-19 had in ESG? Do you think it was a positive for the adoption of ESG practices and put more relevance on the S?
Yeah, I think obviously the COVID-19 pandemic had a lot of human suffering, so it of course brought to the forefront a lot of indeed more social dimensions, whether it was really around health and safety or whether those dimensions were more relating to employment and people losing their jobs in the pandemic, particularly people in jobs that were already not the most stable and high-paying jobs, often in hospitality sectors or restaurants, hotels. So it clearly brought the S to the forefront in ESG analysis. I would also say that the pandemic in general had a positive effect on ESG implementation, partly because stocks and portfolios that were managed with sustainability and ESG in mind tended to have outperformed other investment categories during the pandemic. We saw a situation in which the economy almost came to a standstill, so a number of commodities like oil or gas had very low prices, and that of course also translated into investment portfolios that had a lot of oil and gas exposure, for example, underperformed more sustainably managed portfolios. So that also led to an increased attention to ESG and to sustainability managed portfolios. So I would say definitely, Daniela, to both of your questions, it had a positive impact.
And this year, 2022, has been the year of the ESG deniers. And at your point, and your previous point, this year has been a year where because of the war in Ukraine, I mean, oil prices have peaked. So we are in a very different situation, right? So a lot of controversy has been generated. Academics, journalists, CEOs, politicians have spoken against ESG and woke capitalism. Some of them even saying that ESG should be reduced to carbon emissions, and others even saying that ESG is a scam. So moreover, in the US, some pension funds are not allowed to invest using ESG criteria. What is your opinion about this polarization? And given all that is happening in the world this year, what do you think is next for ESG?
Yeah, no, a lot of very good questions, Daniela. Clearly, February 24th, at the start of the war, it was a big change for the world of ESG. As you mentioned, oil prices and many other commodities and fossil fuels went through the roof, and that meant that investment portfolios that had exposure to these, I'd say, non-sustainable stocks did extremely well, and that sustainability-focused portfolios didn't do so well. And that was then, I would say, the start of a lot of criticism of ESG investing. A lot of voices who were always against ESG, but who didn't really come loudly to the forefront because most ESG portfolios performed well, could now use the change in trend to start criticizing ESG. And that has really led to a significant polarization that we have seen. The best is probably is in the US, where you see the federal government under Biden remaining committed to sustainability and to combating global warming. But on the other hand, you see a number of the states, particularly Florida and Texas, who have issued legislation combating ESG or even making it illegal for investment funds affiliated to the state to invest in funds or with managers who have an ESG focus. So that polarization is very new. I think it's definitely not an easy situation. It makes it much more difficult. For the past 10 years, I think everybody was aligned in their agenda. ESG is important. We all need to combat global warming. And now we see that polarization. I'm afraid that that polarization will remain in place for quite some time. I think like any maturing asset class or any maturing investment strategy, you'll see more people who are very much in favor of it, but you'll also see more and more people who are against it. And I do think that that polarization is here to stay, and we'll see what happens once the war is over. But my gut feeling is that this is going to be with us. I'd say that is definitely one element of what has happened post the start of the war. I would say secondly, you have then a number of topics like people have often avoided investing in, for example, the weapons industry. Now there is then a question, when countries have legitimate needs to defend themselves, like Ukraine, is it smart then that we are not investing in the weapons industry? My personal view is that I think weapons are, we want our police forces and our armed forces to be equipped with weapons, so somebody has to produce them. So I don't think it is wrong to produce them, but on the other hand, I also don't think necessarily that weapons are part of a sustainable portfolio. They are just a product like many other products that I would say from a sustainability perspective are neutral. So I would say that's my view on that topic. Looking to the future a bit and seeing what are some of the most important trends going forward. I do think that regulation is going to be a very important trend for the next years. We've seen in the past 10 years that our free market system, our capitalist system on its own, does not always lead to the societal outcomes that we aim to achieve, and that's normal. That's why we have social security law. That is why we have minimum wages in many countries. And I think now we also need to have a legal and a regulatory framework whereby companies and investors are pushed towards investing in the most into the most sustainable investment opportunities. I think that has started already big time in Europe. I think other countries in the world will probably issue similar legislation in the years to come. So I think that trend is going to remain here. On the other hand, you'll see certain countries or certain states, like I mentioned, Florida and Texas, who make it illegal to consider ESG. So also polarization there, but I think regulation and legislative initiatives will play a much bigger role in the next 10 years than they have played in the last 10 years. And then there is, of course, the issue of energy and the energy transition. And I would say that's also a double. Not so easy to see how that one will play out. On the positive side, from a sustainability perspective, the fact that oil prices and gas prices are extremely high has of course led consumers and corporates to be much more careful and much more efficient in the use of fossil fuels, and that has had a positive effect on society. On the other hand, clearly it has been difficult for consumers, for your average citizen who has been who's received extremely high energy bills. So also there, two different sides. And then the last side there is that it has become again very profitable, at least in the short term, to invest in certain fossil fuel producers, in oil and gas companies. Those have delivered very attractive returns to investors, and that is of course not really aligned with the ESG and sustainability agenda. I do recommend people to think long term, and whether we believe that long term these investments also make financial sense or not. In the short term, yes, they have clearly been very profitable, but long term the risks embedded in those investments are still very much there.
What do you consider the best path in this regard on talking about the energy transition, and how can we achieve a just transition?
I think the best path probably requires us to ban almost all coal. I think that is clearly one source of energy that we should truly avoid if we want to still have any chance to achieve a maximum global warming of 1.5 degrees. I think coal is really not compatible with that pathway. Clearly, natural gas is something that we will need as a society, so I think that is really part of this transition. I'm also personally of the opinion that it was a mistake to stop with nuclear energy. I think nuclear energy clearly has disadvantages, but I think if we weigh the positives and the negatives, I think the fact that it is a fully carbon-free source of energy outweighs the risks that come with nuclear energy. And I think we have seen in quite some countries in the world that nuclear energy can be a safe source of energy, of electricity, without any carbon emissions. So I think the decisions that a number of countries have made, including my own home country, Belgium, but also Germany, to start, to stop certain nuclear power plants, I think that was a mistake, and I think those are being reconsidered. But I do think that nuclear energy is an important, should remain an important source of energy for the next 10 to 20 years. I think the just transition is a very important topic, and I think that's also where I disagree with some of the journalists who have written that ESG should only be about carbon emissions. We should only think about carbon emissions and we should not talk about any other E, S or G factor. I think that is just not going to be possible, because if we are going through this energy transition, it will have significant social repercussions, and those social repercussions will need to be managed, and that leads to governance considerations. So I think E, S and G are very much tied together, and if we want to succeed in that social transition, in that just transition, then clearly the S factor is a very important element. So I normally very much like The Economist, but I think the suggestion that we should only be talking about carbon emissions, I think is a bit too simplistic and not aligned with I would call the sustainable development objectives that we have as a society.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, it is the essence of sustainability, no? At the end, to have a balance between all the factors, right? Well, no, thank you, Tycho, for your time, and thank you for joining us on this episode of ESG Talks.
Thank you, Daniela, very much, and have a very nice day.
Yeah, you too. Agradezco también a quienes se quedaron conectados con nosotros. Mi nombre es Daniela Door, gerente de Alternativos y Análisis de Prima FP, y nos vemos en una siguiente oportunidad. Muchas gracias.